My name is Avery Montez. I am 24 years old and 3 weeks ago, I collapsed in front of 400 people at the most important night of my professional life. The paramedics came. The hospital called my parents. My mother didn't answer. My father didn't answer. My older sister Sabrina was too busy at a rooftop bar in downtown Louisville to pick up the phone. But my grandmother, 71 years old, bad knees, no driver's license, somehow got herself a cab, rode 40 minutes across the city in the dark, and was sitting next to my hospital bed holding my hand before I even regained consciousness. And when I finally opened my eyes, the first thing she said to me was, "I told you that you needed to eat more, baby." I didn't laugh. I didn't cry. I just held her hand tighter and thought about how this one woman, this tiny fierce woman who reused plastic bags and kept butterscotch candies in her cardigan pocket, was the only person in my entire family who had ever shown up when it actually mattered. That was 3 weeks ago. What happened after, what my parents did when they finally did show up, what I found out about money that had been kept from me for years, and what I said in that hospital room that I can never take back and don't want to, that is the story I need to tell. So stay with me because this one goes deep. Before I get into it, if you've ever been the one in your family who does everything right and somehow still ends up invisible, this story is for you. And if you want to hear how it ends, because it does end, just not the way anyone expected, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next part. This story is told in parts and every single part gets heavier. You'll want to be here for all of it. Now let me take you back. Not to the night I collapsed, we'll get there, but to 6 weeks before that, because that's when everything started unraveling even if I didn't know it yet. 6 weeks before the award ceremony, I was sitting at my desk at 11:30 at night in the one-bedroom apartment I rented in the Highlands neighborhood of Louisville, Kentucky, surrounded by budget spreadsheets and cold coffee and a half-eaten granola bar I had convinced myself counted as dinner. I was a junior financial analyst at a regional nonprofit called Bright Path Community Partners, and I had just been nominated for the Kentucky Young Professional Excellence Award, a recognition given every year to one person under 30 in the nonprofit sector who demonstrated what the committee called outstanding impact and leadership. Out of 63 nominees across the entire state, I had been selected as a finalist. 3 finalists. I was one of them. I had worked for this moment for 4 years. 4 years of 70-hour weeks, of skipping vacations, of turning down better-paying corporate jobs because I believed in the mission, of eating sad granola bars at midnight and telling myself it was worth it. And now here I was. A finalist. I should have been celebrating. Instead I was trying to figure out how to afford a dress for the ceremony because my bank account had exactly $312 in it after rent, utilities, and my student loan payment cleared. I called my mother. This was my first mistake, though not my last. "Mom," I said when she picked up, "I just wanted to let you know that the award ceremony is on the 14th. I'd love for you and Dad to come." There was a pause on the other end. The kind of pause that meant she was either distracted or calculating. "The 14th, she repeated. "Avery, that's the same weekend as Sabrina's gender reveal." I closed my eyes. "Mom," I said carefully, "the ceremony is on Friday evening. Sabrina's gender reveal is Sunday afternoon. They're not even the same day." Another pause. "Well, your father and I are driving up from Elizabethtown on Saturday morning to help set up. We won't have time to turn around and come back on Friday." I sat there for a moment just holding the phone, looking at the spreadsheet on my screen, looking at the granola bar. "Okay," I said finally. "I understand." And I hung up before she could hear anything in my voice that I didn't want her to hear. Here is the thing about being the responsible one in a family. Nobody ever decides you are the responsible one. It just happens slowly, the way water shapes a rock. And one day you look up and realize that your entire identity within your family has been constructed around your usefulness and your silence. I had been useful and silent for as long as I could remember. I was the one who filed the FAFSA for myself because my parents forgot. I was the one who took out loans to pay for college while Sabrina's tuition was covered without a single conversation about it. I was the one who called to check on Grandma Loretta every Sunday because nobody else remembered to. I was the one who helped plan every holiday gathering, who remembered every appointment, who fixed every crisis quietly and without acknowledgement. And Sabrina, beautiful, loud, effortless Sabrina, was the one who got the parties, the celebrations, the attention, the funding. She was 30 years old, currently pregnant with her second child, currently between jobs, and currently the absolute center of the entire family's universe. I was not bitter about Sabrina's pregnancy. I want to be clear about that. I was thrilled for her. What I was bitter about, if I'm being honest in the way that AITA posts require you to be honest, was the arithmetic of it. The way my parents could drive 2 hours to help set up a gender reveal but couldn't drive 45 minutes on a different day to watch their younger daughter potentially receive a statewide professional award. The way that math always worked out the same no matter how many times I ran the numbers. My best friend Deja Thomas called me that same night because Deja has a radar for when I am sitting alone in my apartment doing math that makes me feel terrible. She showed up at my door 40 minutes later with a bottle of wine and a look on her face that said she already knew what had happened. "They're not coming, are they?" she said. It wasn't a question. I told her about the gender reveal conflict. Deja, who had known my family for 3 years and had witnessed enough to form very strong opinions, sat down on my couch and was quiet for a moment in the specific way that meant she was choosing her words carefully. "Avery," she said, "Sabrina's gender reveal is 2 days after your ceremony. Not 2 hours. 2 days. "I know," I said. "So their excuse is that they need to be in position like it's a military operation." I almost smiled. "That's basically it, yeah." She refilled my glass. "Okay," she said. "Then we're going to that ceremony and we're going to get you the most incredible dress within your budget and you're going to win and it's going to be amazing. And your grandmother's going to be there. She's already confirmed, right?" I nodded. Grandma Loretta had called me the moment I told her I was a finalist. She hadn't asked about conflicts or logistics. She had simply said, "Tell me what time and what color you're wearing so I can coordinate." Grandma Loretta Montez was 71 years old and had lived in the same house in the Shively neighborhood of Louisville for 43 years. She was my father's mother, which sometimes surprised people who assumed the warmth in our relationship meant she was on my mother's side. She was not on anyone's side. She was on my side, which was different. She had been widowed when my father was 19, had raised him and his 2 brothers alone on a seamstress's income, and had the particular brand of quiet authority that comes from having survived things that would have leveled most people. She was also the only member of my family who had attended every single significant moment of my life. Every graduation. Every recital when I was small. Every ceremony, every presentation, every quiet milestone that no one else thought to mark. She showed up. That was her defining characteristic. She simply showed up. I had been having headaches for about 2 weeks by then. I told myself it was stress. I told myself it was the screen time, the late nights, the bad eating habits, the pressure of the finalist announcement and the work that kept piling up regardless of personal milestones. The headaches would come in the afternoon and sit behind my right eye like something pressing from the inside, and I would take ibuprofen and drink water and keep working. One evening I got dizzy stepping off the elevator at work and had to hold the wall for a moment before I could keep walking. My coworker Jess noticed and asked if I was okay. I told her I hadn't eaten lunch. Which was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I hadn't been feeling right for days and I had no time to deal with it, and the ceremony was in 2 weeks and I just needed to hold it together until after. Grandma Loretta called me 4 days before the ceremony. She asked how I was feeling. I said fine. She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds in that way she had, and then she said, "Avery Marie Montes, I have known you for 24 years and I know what fine sounds like coming out of your mouth, and that was not it." I laughed despite myself. I told her about the headaches. She told me to go to the doctor. I told her I would go after the ceremony. She told me that was the most foolish thing she had ever heard. We went back and forth about it the way we always did, and then she said something that I didn't think about again until I was lying in a hospital bed. She said, "Baby, your body is not a machine you can schedule maintenance on. It will tell you when it needs attention and it will not wait for your calendar to clear. It's all he loved here." She told me to eat a real meal. We hung up. I took 2 more ibuprofen and went back to my spreadsheets. The night of the ceremony arrived the way big nights always do, faster than you're ready for and heavier than you expected. I had found a dress at a consignment shop on Bardstown Road, deep green, fitted, exactly the kind of thing that looked intentional rather than budgeted. Deja had done my hair. Grandma Loretta had called that morning and left a voicemail that I saved and still have on my phone to this day. It said, "Avery, I ironed my good blouse and I am ready. I will be in the front row with my camera and I will embarrass you so thoroughly that you will have no choice but to win just to justify the trouble." I listened to it twice in the car on the way over, and both times it made my chest feel like something warm was sitting inside it. The ceremony was held at the Olmsted, a beautifully restored event venue in Louisville that smelled like old wood and fresh flowers. 400 people filled the main hall, Nonprofit directors, city officials, board members, donors, colleagues. Round tables with white linens. A podium at the front with the Kentucky Young Professional Excellence Award banner stretched behind it. I had been to events like this before in a professional capacity, carrying clipboards and refilling water pitchers, but I had never been to one as a finalist. It felt different from that side of it. It felt terrifyingly real. Deja and Grandma Loretta were already seated when I arrived. Grandma Loretta had worn her good blouse, exactly as promised, cream-colored with small pearl buttons, and she had her camera out and aimed at me before I even reached the table. "You look beautiful," she said, and the way she said it was not the way people say it when they mean you look fine. She meant it the way you mean something when you have been waiting a long time to say it out loud. I sat down next to her and she squeezed my hand once, firmly, and said nothing else. She didn't need to. Deja across the table mouthed the words, "You've got this," and I almost believed her. The program started at 7. There were remarks from the executive director of the sponsoring foundation, a keynote from a city council member, and then the award presentations. My category was third. I sat through the first two with my hands folded in my lap and my pulse doing things that no amount of deep breathing was correcting. The headache that had been sitting behind my right eye for 2 weeks had come back that afternoon despite the ibuprofen, duller than before but persistent like a sound you can't locate. I had eaten a full meal that day specifically because Grandma Loretta had told me to, and I was grateful for that much. I drank Water. I sat up straight. I smiled at the right moments. I was holding myself together with both hands. They announced the third category. The presenter, a woman named Dr. Carol Finch who chaired the selection committee, walked to the podium and began reading the finalist bios. She read the first one. Applause. She read the second one. More applause. And then she said, "Our third finalist is a junior financial analyst at BrightPath Community Partners in Louisville, whose work developing a data-driven resource allocation model resulted in a 31% increase in program efficiency and directly impacted over 2,000 families in the greater Louisville area over the past fiscal year. Please welcome Avery Montez." The applause was immediate and full, and I stood up from my chair on reflex, the way your body moves before your brain catches up. Grandma Loretta was already on her feet. I could see her out of the corner of my eye, clapping with her whole body the way she did everything, completely without reservation, without caring who was watching. I walked to the stage. I shook Dr. Finch's hand. I stood at the podium between the two other finalists, both of whom were older than me, both of whom had been in the sector longer, both of whom had organizations behind them and business cards with impressive titles and the particular ease of people who had been in rooms like this many times before. I had a green consignment dress and a grandmother in a cream blouse with a camera. I told myself that was enough. I told myself it was more than enough. Dr. Finch returned to the podium to announce the winner. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when everyone is holding their breath at the same time. She opened the envelope. She looked at the card. She smiled. And then she said, "This year's Kentucky Young Professional Excellence Award goes to Avery Montez of BrightPath Community Partners." The room erupted. I heard Grandma Loretta before I heard anyone else. Not a scream but a sound, something between a gasp and a sob, the kind of sound a person makes when they have been waiting for something good to happen for someone they love and it finally does. I walked to the center of the stage. Dr. Finch handed me a crystal award that was heavier than it looked and shook my hand again and said quietly right into my ear, "You earned this. Every number in your application was extraordinary." I thanked her. I turned to face the room. 400 people. Applause rolling toward me like something physical. And then the lights tilted. It wasn't dramatic the way it sounds when I describe it now. It wasn't a sudden collapse. It was more like the floor shifted 2 inches to the left without warning, and the sound in the room went distant, and the crystal award in my hands became very heavy, and the light from the stage fixtures above me went from white to a kind of blurred gold. I gripped the podium with my free hand. Thought not now. Thought hold on. I thought about the green dress and the consignment tag I had cut out that morning and Grandma Loretta's cream blouse, and I thought, you did not come this far to fall down right now. But the body does not negotiate. The body does not care about ceremony venues or crystal awards or the 400 people watching. The body simply does what it has been trying to tell you it needed to do for 2 weeks while you kept swallowing ibuprofen and going back to your spreadsheets. My knees went first. Then everything else. I heard the crystal award hit the stage floor a half second before I did, and that sound, that sharp ringing crack of crystal on hardwood, was the last clear thing I heard before the darkness came up fast and took everything with it. I did not feel myself hit the floor. I did not hear the room react. I did not hear the first person shout for someone to call 911, or the sound of chairs scraping back, or Deja's voice cutting through the crowd, or Grandma Loretta saying my name. I was simply gone the way a light goes out, completely and without warning, one moment present and the next moment not. What happened in the room after that, I know only from Deja, who told me everything later in the hospital in the careful, measured way she tells me things she knows will be hard to hear. People moved fast. A man at the table nearest the stage turned out to be an ER physician who had come as a guest of one of the nonprofit board members, and he was on the stage within seconds, checking my airway, checking my pulse, telling the room to give me space in a voice that cut through the panic cleanly. Someone called 911. Someone else brought water that was not needed. A woman in the back of the room was crying. The Crystal Award had rolled to the edge of the stage and stopped there, right at the lip as if it was waiting. Grandma Loretta was at the foot of the stage before anyone stopped her. Deja told me she did not push through the crowd so much as the crowd simply parted for her. This 71-year-old woman moving with a kind of focused stillness that made people step aside without being asked. She could not get onto the stage while the physician was working, but she stood at the edge of it with her hand on my foot, which was the part of me she could reach, and she held on. Deja said she did not cry. She did not speak. She just held on and watched my face and waited. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. They assessed me on the stage, got me onto a stretcher, and moved me out through a side exit while the event coordinator quietly asked the room to please be seated and assured everyone that the situation was being handled. Deja told me later that the room did not really settle. People sat down but they did not stop talking, and the energy in the hall had shifted into something nobody was going to recover from that evening. In the ambulance, Grandma Loretta held my hand the entire way even though she had to sit on a jump seat that was clearly not designed for comfort. The paramedic asked her if she was family. She said, "I am her grandmother and I am not leaving this vehicle, so please just drive." He drove. At University of Louisville Hospital, while the intake team moved me into an exam bay and started running tests, a staff member at the front desk pulled out the emergency contact form that the event venue had on file, a standard form that all award finalists had submitted as part of the registration process. Primary contact my father Ramon Montez. Secondary contact my mother Diane Montez. The staff member called both numbers. My father's phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. My mother's phone rang twice and went to voicemail. They left messages on both. They called again. Voicemail again. A nurse tried a 3rd time from a different number in case my parents were screening calls from the hospital line. Nothing. Grandma Loretta was already there. She had never left. The doctors figured out what was wrong with me at 2:17 in the morning. I know the exact time because Grandma Loretta told me later that she had been watching the clock on the wall of the waiting room the way you watch a clock when every minute feels like it has weight to it. The neurologist on call, a calm, precise man named Dr. Allison, came out and found her sitting in the same chair she had occupied since they wheeled me past the double doors, still in her cream blouse, her camera bag on the seat beside her, her hands folded in her lap. He sat down across from her and told her that the MRI results showed a cerebral arteriovenous malformation, an AVM he called it, a tangle of abnormal blood vessels in my brain that had been there likely since birth, that had been quietly building pressure for years, and that had finally announced itself in the most public way possible. It had not ruptured. That was the part he emphasized. It had not ruptured, and that was the difference between a very serious situation and a catastrophic one. But it needed to be treated, and it needed to be treated soon, and there were decisions that needed to be made by someone who had the legal standing to make them. Grandma Loretta listened to all of this without interrupting. When Dr. Ellison finished, she asked him 3 questions. She asked whether I was in pain. He said I was sedated and comfortable. She asked whether the procedure was something that could wait until morning. He said ideally no, that the sooner they could begin the treatment protocol the better the outcome projections. She asked what he needed from her. He told her he needed a family member with medical decision-making authority to sign the consent forms. Grandma Loretta looked at him for a moment and then said, "Her parents are not here and they are not answering their phones. I am her grandmother. Tell me what I need to sign." Dr. Ellison explained gently that without a healthcare proxy document, he could not legally accept her signature in place of a parent for a patient who was an adult. Grandma Loretta did not flinch. She said, Then you need to keep trying those numbers, and so do I, because my granddaughter is not waiting on a procedure because her parents won't pick up their phones. Deja had arrived at the hospital by then, still in her clothes from the ceremony, and she sat beside Grandma Loretta and they called my parents together. Deja called my mother 4 times from her personal cell. Grandma Loretta called my father twice and then called my Aunt Patricia, my father's younger sister, who answered immediately and said she would try to reach him directly. At 12:40 in the morning my father finally picked up. Not for the hospital. Not for Grandma Loretta. He picked up for Aunt Patricia, who told me afterward that when she explained what had happened, there was a pause on the line that lasted long enough that she thought the call had dropped. Then my father said, "Is it serious?" Aunt Patricia told him that his daughter was in the ER with a brain condition that needed immediate treatment and that the hospital had been trying to reach him for over 2 hours. My father said he would call the hospital. Then he hung up and called my mother first because that is the kind of man my father has always been. The kind who checks with his wife before he acts, even when the thing he needs to act on is his daughter in a hospital bed. My mother called the hospital at 1:15 in the morning. She spoke to a nurse, not to Dr. Ellison, and the nurse explained the situation and told her that verbal consent over the phone was not sufficient for the procedure and that they needed a family member present or a signed healthcare proxy form. My mother said she was 4 hours away in Elizabethtown and that she could not get there until morning. The nurse said she understood and asked if there was anyone closer who could come. My mother said she would have to make some calls. She did not make those calls. What she did instead, I found out the next day from Aunt Patricia, was text my father and say that the hospital had it under control and that they would drive up in the morning. That is a direct quote. The hospital has it under control. Her daughter was sedated in a neurology unit with an untreated vascular malformation in her brain, and her assessment of the situation was that the hospital had it under control. What saved me, and I do not use that phrase lightly, was that when Dr. Ellison reviewed my intake paperwork more carefully, he found a medical information card in my wallet that I had filled out 2 years earlier as part of a workplace wellness initiative at Brightpath. It was a small laminated card, the kind they hand out at health fairs, and on the back of it in my own handwriting was a line that read, "Emergency contact if parents unreachable, Loretta Montez grandmother." I had written her number. I had listed her as the person to call if everything else failed, and I had done it so automatically, so without ceremony, that I had completely forgotten the card existed. Dr. Ellison brought the card to Grandma Loretta. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked up at him and said, "She always did have more sense than the rest of them." He smiled. He had her sign the forms. They began my treatment at 2:34 in the morning. I woke up the following afternoon to a ceiling I didn't recognize and a pressure behind my eyes that was different from the headache. Softer, medicated, like pain that had been moved to another room. The first thing I saw clearly was Grandma Loretta's face. She was asleep in the recliner they had moved into my room at some point, still in the cream blouse, her camera bag on the floor beside her, her reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead. She looked smaller asleep than she did awake. She looked like a person who had been sitting in uncomfortable chairs for a very long time and had finally allowed herself to rest because the thing she was waiting for had happened. I watched her for a moment before I said anything. I wanted to hold that image before anything else came in to complicate it. Deja was awake. She was sitting on the windowsill with her shoes off and her phone in her lap, and when she saw my eyes open she was at my bedside in 3 steps. She took my hand. He said my name. She said I was okay, that the procedure had gone well, that Dr. Ellison had explained everything and would come back to explain it again when I was alert enough to process it. I asked her what time it was. She told me. I asked her where my parents were. She paused for exactly 1 second too long, which told me everything before she said a word. They were on their way, she said. They had left Elizabethtown that morning. Traffic on I-65 had been slow. They would be here within the hour. I said okay. I looked back at Grandma Loretta sleeping in the recliner. I thought about the laminated card in my wallet, the one I had forgotten about, the one that had her name on it. I thought about how I had written her name on that card not because anyone told me to, not because she was the obvious choice, but because somewhere in the part of me that operates beneath logic and obligation, I had always known the truth about my family. I had known it so thoroughly and for so long that it had become a kind of background noise, something you stop hearing because it is always there. She was the one who would come. She had always been the one who would come. And she had. My parents arrived at 3:50 in the afternoon. I heard my mother before I saw her. The particular rhythm of her walk, heels on linoleum, purposeful and slightly too fast, the walk of someone who is performing urgency rather than feeling it. My father was quieter behind her. He always was. The door opened and my mother came in with her arms already extended, already moving toward me with the expression she wore at funerals and difficult dinners, the expression that said she had decided in the car how this was going to go. "Avery, baby," she said. "Oh, thank God." She hugged me before I could decide whether I wanted her to. I let her. I did not hug back. My father stood at the foot of the bed. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the drive. He looked like a man who had been trying not to think about something all morning and had failed. He said my name once, quietly, and then he looked at his mother in the recliner, Grandma Loretta, who had woken up when the door opened and was now sitting upright, watching him with an expression I had never seen on her face before and hope never to see again. It was not anger. It was something older and more final than anger. It was the face of a woman who had made a decision and was at peace with it and was waiting for the right moment to say so. My mother pulled back from the hug and looked at me and said, "You gave us the scare of our lives." I looked at her. I thought about the nurse calling 4 times. I thought about my mother's text to my father. "The hospital has it under control." I thought about Grandma Loretta's name on a laminated card in my wallet, written there by a version of me who had known the truth long before I was ready to say it out loud. "Did I said. It was not a question. My mother's expression flickered. And that was when the real conversation, the one that had been waiting years to happen, finally began. My mother sat down in the chair beside my bed and folded her hands in her lap the way she did when she was preparing to be reasonable. That was always how she framed difficult conversations, as exercises in reasonableness, as though the goal was not honesty but the appearance of calm. My father stood near the window. Grandma Loretta had not moved from the recliner and she did not intend to. Deja had stepped out into the hallway when my parents arrived, but I had asked her to stay close, and I knew she was just outside the door because that is who Deja is. She does not go far when she thinks you might need her. My mother began by saying that they had been worried sick. She said it in that specific tone that carries an accusation inside a statement of concern, as though my collapsing at an award ceremony was something I had arranged to inconvenience her. She said the drive had been stressful, that traffic had been terrible, that she had barely slept. She said they had wanted to come sooner but there were things that needed to be handled first. I listened to all of this without responding. I had learned a long time ago that when my mother was performing concern, the most effective thing you could do was simply not participate in the performance. You don't argue with theater. You wait for the curtain to come down and then you say what actually needs to be said. It came down when she said, "We came as fast as we could, Avery." I looked at her. Then I said, "The hospital called at 10:41 last night. It is now almost 4 in the afternoon. Elizabethtown is an hour and 40 minutes from Louisville on a clear day. So when you say you came as fast as you could, I need you to help me understand what that means exactly." My mother looked at my father. My father looked at the window. Grandma Loretta said nothing, but I felt her presence in the room the way you feel a change in temperature. The kind that tells you a storm has been building for a long time and has finally decided to arrive. My mother said that they had needed to figure out arrangements, that Sabrina had needed to be told and had been very upset by the news. I said, "Your daughter was in a hospital requiring emergency neurological treatment, and you waited until morning because Sabrina needed time." My mother said that was not how she would characterize it. I said, "How would you characterize it?" The silence that followed was the longest I have ever sat inside. Outside in the hallway I could hear the ordinary sounds of a hospital. Footsteps, PA announcements, the distant roll of a cart. All of it completely indifferent to the conversation happening in room 214. My father turned from the window. He looked at me with something between guilt and exhaustion and what resembled relief, as though a conversation he had been dreading for years had arrived and the anticipation had been worse than the thing itself. He said, "Avery, your mother and I have not always handled things the way we should have." I said, "That is an interesting way to begin." He flinched. Good. I was not lying in a hospital bed with a healing vascular condition to be gentle about this moment. Grandma Loretta spoke then for the first time since my parents had entered the room. She did not raise her voice. She said, "Ramon, I want you to tell Avery what you told me 6 months ago. About the account." My father went very still. My mother's head turned toward him slowly. I said, "What account?" Grandma Loretta kept her eyes on my father. He looked at his hands. And then, because there was nowhere left to go, he told me. When I was born, Grandma Loretta had opened a dedicated savings account in my name. She had contributed every year, birthday money, holiday money, income from private alterations work, and eventually a portion of a small inheritance from her own mother that she had decided she did not need and that I would someday. By the time I turned 18, the account held enough to cover 2 full years of in-state college tuition. She had told my father about it when I started high school so it could factor into planning. My father told my mother. And my mother, who managed the family finances, had decided that since Sabrina was older and entering college first, it made practical sense to draw from the account for Sabrina's first 2 years and replenish it before I started. The replenishment never happened. By the time I was filling out financial aid forms, the account was empty, and my father had told me that Grandma Loretta's savings were tied up and not accessible. Technically accurate in the sense that the money had been spent, just not in any way that sentence was meant to imply. I had taken out federal loans. I had worked 25 hours a week through 4 years of college while maintaining the GPA my scholarship required. I had skipped every spring break, worn secondhand everything for 3 straight years, and calculated every grocery run to the last dollar while watching Sabrina take a semester abroad that my parents funded without discussion. And the entire time, the explanation I had been given for why there was no cushion was a deliberate, sustained lie. I looked at my mother. She was staring past my left shoulder, the look of someone who has decided to absorb whatever is coming rather than meet it. I said, "You spent money your mother-in-law saved specifically for me, used it for Sabrina without telling me, and then constructed a story about why I couldn't have it." My mother said, "It was a practical decision. The timing made sense for the family." I said, "It made sense to you. I was the one eating canned soup for 2 winters." She said nothing. My father said, "I should have told you the truth." I said, "You let me believe for 4 years that running myself into the ground was simply my reality. That there was no other way. And the whole time you knew there had been money and where it went." He said yes. 1 word. I said, "Is the reason you're telling me now because you believe I deserve the truth? Or because Grandma told you she was going to tell me herself and you needed to get ahead of it?" He didn't answer. His silence was its own kind of answer. My mother said this was clearly a difficult moment and that perhaps a conversation this significant deserved more time and space than a hospital room. I said, "I am lying here because I spent years pushing my body past what it could handle, trying to build a life that could have been built with far less damage if someone had been honest with me. This is exactly the right room for this conversation." I told her I was not going to offer forgiveness. I didn't have to make this easier for her. I told her I had spent my entire adult life accommodating the family narrative that I was self-sufficient and low maintenance and fine, and that I now understood that narrative had been profoundly convenient for everyone except me. Being easy to overlook was not a trait I had been born with. It was something I had learned because needing things in this family had always felt like making myself visible in a way that was not entirely welcome. My mother's eyes filled. She said, "We love you." I said, "I believe you feel that. But love that doesn't show up when it's needed most is just a private feeling. It doesn't do anything for the person it's supposed to be for." My father put his face in his hands. Grandma Loretta watched him from across the room and did not move toward him. She let him sit in it, and that small decision told me more about where things stood than anything she could have said out loud. Then Sabrina arrived. Nobody had told me she was coming, and when the door opened she took in the room in 2 seconds and said nothing for a moment. She set her bag down. She looked at me and said quietly and without any performance attached to it, "Avery, how are you actually doing?" It was the first time in longer than I could immediately recall that Sabrina had asked me something that was entirely and only about me. I said, "I've been better. But I think I might eventually be a lot better than I've been in a long time." She stayed near the wall and said nothing further. She seemed to understand that the most useful thing she could do right now was witness. My mother said she needed water, which was her way of leaving before the tears came. My father stayed. He and I looked at each other and I thought about all the years of careful silences, all the times he had stood in doorways rather than walking into rooms. I said, "I'm not saying all of this to punish you. I'm saying it because I am 24 years old, I almost died last night, and I am done carrying the weight of things that were never mine to carry." His jaw was tight. I said, "The question now is not what you say in this room. It's what you actually do after you leave it." He said, I understand. I said, I hope so. And I meant it as both a boundary and something that still, despite everything, resembled hope. Deja came back in after my parents filtered out. My mother for water she didn't need, my father for a phone call, Sabrina somewhere in between. Deja closed the door and looked at me and said, I heard most of that from the hallway. Are you okay? I thought about it honestly. I said, I think I might be more okay than I've been in years, which is a strange thing to say from a hospital bed. She sat on the windowsill. Grandma Loretta was quiet in her recliner. The room held a stillness that felt different from before. Not empty but cleared, the way a space feels after something heavy has finally been moved out of it. Grandma Loretta looked at me and said, I should have told you sooner. I need you to know I know that. I said, you were trying to protect me. She said, I'm not sure it was the right call. I said, it doesn't matter now. What matters is what happens next. She nodded. Outside, Louisville continued its evening without us, and I lay in the quiet and felt, for the first time in longer than I could track, like the ground beneath me was actually solid. 3 weeks after I was discharged from University of Louisville Hospital, I went back to work. Not because I had to. Dr. Ellison had given me 6 weeks and made clear he would not be held responsible for my vascular system if I ignored him, but because my desk, my work, was the one place in my life that had never asked anything of me I didn't choose to give. Bright Path had sent flowers to the hospital. My supervisor Carol had called 3 times to check in and not once mentioned a deadline. He just asked how I was and listened. That sounds like a small thing. After the last several years of my life, it was not small at all. The Crystal Award had survived the fall. One of the event staff had retrieved it from the stage that night and brought it to the hospital, and it had sat on my bedside table through the entire recovery, which I found either deeply meaningful or deeply ironic depending on what hour of the day it was when I looked at it. I brought it home when I was discharged and put it on the shelf above my desk in my apartment in the Highlands, and sometimes I would look at it while I was working and think about the fraction of a second between hearing my name called as the winner and hitting the stage floor. That fraction of a second is the whole story, really. Everything I had built, everything I had earned, everything I had sacrificed, and my body had simply said enough. Not as a punishment. Not as a failure. As information. Information I had been refusing to receive for 2 years, delivered in the only way I had left it any room to deliver it. Grandma Loretta came for dinner every Sunday. That was new. Or rather, it was a formalization of something that had always existed informally, her presence in my life treated as a given rather than an arrangement. We would cook together in my small kitchen and she would tell me stories about my father when he was young, stories that made him sound simultaneously more human and more comprehensible than the man I had watched stare out hospital windows. She told me about the year he lost his job when I was 3 and how he had sat at the kitchen table every morning for 4 months filling out applications and not saying a word about how scared he was because he did not have the language for scared, only for fine. She told me that silence was the Montez family inheritance, passed down father to son like a piece of furniture nobody particularly wanted but nobody knew how to get rid of. She said she had spent 40 years trying to return it to sender. I told her it seemed like she had made some progress. She said, not enough. But some. My father called every Tuesday. That had started in the hospital and continued week after week, with a consistency I had initially been waiting to break and that had not broken. The calls were not long. They were not effortless. There was still a stilted quality to them, the quality of 2 people learning a language they should have been speaking for years and are only now picking up the grammar of. But he called. He asked questions and waited for the answers. He asked about my work and about Deja, and once, unprompted, he asked about the Crystal Award, whether I had found somewhere to put it, whether it had survived the fall intact. I told him it had. He said, good. You earned that. 4 words. He had never said anything like that to me before in my life. I did not tell him that. I just said thank you and meant it more than he probably knew. My mother was harder. She had started seeing a therapist. She told me this in a text 3 weeks after the hospital, a message that was clearly composed and revised several times before being sent, all rough edges filed off. She said she was working through some things. She said she understood that she had caused harm and was trying to understand why. She did not ask for forgiveness, which I respected more than I would have respected a request. I wrote back and said I was glad she was getting support and that I would be in touch when I was ready. I had not been ready yet. I was working on it. That was the honest answer, and I had decided somewhere between the hospital and the present that honest answers were the only ones I had any interest in giving anymore. Sabrina called me 6 weeks after the hospital. Not to ask for anything. To tell me that she had been thinking about what she witnessed in that room and had started to understand something about the way our family worked that she had been insulated from her entire life by the simple fact of being the one it worked in favor of. She said she didn't expect absolution. She just wanted me to know she was starting to look at things differently. I listened. I believed the part where her voice went quiet and unperformed, the part that sounded like a person actually reckoning rather than performing one. I told her I appreciated the call and that I was more interested in her actions over the next year than anything we could say today. She said she understood. We hung up and I sat with the phone in my hand thinking about how strange it was to feel something that was neither forgiveness nor resentment but something open in the space between them. Deja threw me a belated celebration dinner 7 weeks after the ceremony, at a restaurant on Frankfurt Avenue with good bread and good lighting, and because she said, "You won a statewide award and then nearly died and you have not once been properly celebrated." There were 8 people at the table. Grandma Loretta in a deep blue blouse and her good earrings, who gave a toast that made 3 people cry including herself. Deja, whose laugh fills every room she enters. My co-worker Jess. And Aunt Patricia, who had driven up from Elizabethtown and who had, I learned that evening, quietly told Sabrina's boyfriend what had happened during my hospitalization, not out of malice but because she believed people's characters ought to be visible to the people. Building lives with them. I did not ask her to feel bad about that. At some point during dessert, Grandma Loretta reached into her bag and produced a small envelope and set it in front of me. She said, "Open it at home. Not here." I said, "Why not here?" She said, "Because you'll cry and I just fixed my mascara." I put the envelope in my bag. Later that night, alone in my apartment with the city quiet outside and the Crystal Award catching the lamplight on its shelf, I opened it. Inside was a card in her careful cursive handwriting, and inside the card was a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it. It was a bank statement for an account I had never seen before. A new account opened 3 months ago in my name with a balance that made me sit down on the floor because my legs simply stopped cooperating. At the bottom of the card she had written, "I couldn't give you back what was taken, but I can give you what I have now. This is yours. No conditions. No intermediaries. Just mine to you the way it was always supposed to be." I sat on my apartment floor for a long time. I thought about the laminated card in my wallet with her name on it. I thought about the cream blouse and the camera and her hand on my foot at the edge of the stage while everything around her was chaos. I thought about what it means to be chosen. Not because of what you produce or what you carry or how quietly you absorb the weight of other people's failures, but simply because of who you are. Because someone looked at you and decided you were worth showing up for. Always. Without condition. Without calculation. I called her. It was late and she answered on the second ring, which told me she had been awake waiting. I said, "Grandma." She said, "I know." I said, "I don't know what to say." She said, "You don't have to say anything. Just take care of yourself. That is all I have ever wanted." I said, "I will." She said, "I know you will. I just want it to be easier from here." We stayed on the phone for a while after that without saying very much, the comfortable silence of 2 people who have run out of necessary words and are simply keeping each other company in the quiet. Outside my window, Louisville was doing what cities do at night. Existing, continuing, indifferent to the small private revolutions happening inside lit windows of ordinary apartments. I looked at the Crystal Award on my shelf. And I thought about something Grandma Loretta had told me years ago when I was in college and exhausted and calling her because I had nowhere else to put it. She had said, "The people who were built to survive hard things sometimes forget that surviving was never supposed to be the whole point. You were built for more than endurance, Avery. Don't let anyone, including yourself, convince you otherwise." I had written it down and forgotten it. Sitting on my apartment floor with a bank statement in my hand and her voice still warm in my ear, I finally understood what she had meant. And I decided for the first time in my adult life, to actually believe her. 6 months after the night I collapsed on a stage in downtown Louisville, I got a phone call from Dr. Ellison's office that I had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure since my discharge. The follow-up MRI results were in. I sat in my car in the Bright Path parking lot with my phone pressed to my ear and listened to his nurse read the findings in that careful, measured tone that medical professionals use when they are about to say something that matters. The AVM was stable. The treatment had held. There were no new developments, no concerning changes, nothing that required further intervention at this time. She said Dr. Allison wanted to see me annually going forward, standard monitoring, nothing urgent. I said thank you. I hung up. I sat in my car for 10 minutes doing absolutely nothing, which is the only appropriate response to being told that the thing inside your head that tried to kill you has decided for now to leave you alone. I called Grandma Loretta before I called anyone else. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting, which meant she had known the call was coming today because I had told her the appointment date and she had been carrying it quietly ever since. I said, "It's stable." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Of course it is. I have been lighting a candle at St. Michael's every Thursday for 6 months and I fully intend to invoice God if this had gone any other way." I laughed so hard I fogged up the windshield. It was the first time in 6 months that I had laughed like that, the whole body kind, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and unguarded, and I sat in that parking lot and let it happen and did not try to manage it or make it smaller than it was. The 6 months had not been simple. I want to be clear about that because stories like mine have a tendency to flatten out in the telling, to make the aftermath sound cleaner than it actually is. The truth is that recovery from a vascular event is not a straight line. There were weeks where the fatigue was so heavy that I came home from work and sat on my couch and could not summon the energy to make dinner. Weeks where the headaches came back in a milder form and sent a cold spike of fear through me every time because fear, once it has had a reason to exist, does not simply evict itself when the reason is gone. I went to therapy. That was Deja's doing. She had found the therapist, texted me the information with a single line that said, "Just try one session," and then never mentioned it again, which is exactly the right amount of pressure to apply to someone who has spent their entire life convinced that needing help is a personal failing. I went. Kept going. I'm still going. It turns out that 24 years of carrying things that were not yours to carry leaves a residue that does not scrub out in a few weeks of good sleep and clean air, and that the work of actually putting those things down is slower and stranger and more necessary than I had imagined. My father and I had dinner together for the first time in 3 years on a Tuesday evening in February, at a diner on Dixie Highway that he had suggested because he used to take me there when I was small and had apparently been thinking about that. He arrived before me and was already seated when I walked in, and when he stood up he looked uncertain in a way I had never seen on him before. Not the closed, managed uncertainty of a man holding himself carefully, but the open, exposed uncertainty of a person who is not sure they deserve the seat they're sitting in and is showing up anyway. We ate and we talked and it was imperfect and real, and at one point he said without prompting, that he had been thinking about the years I was in college and that he was ashamed of what he had allowed to happen. He did not dress it up or contextualize it into something more comfortable. He just said it and let it sit on the table between us. I told him I was not ready to call us repaired but that I was willing to call us in progress. He said that was more than he had a right to ask for. I told him he was probably right. We split the check. He hugged me in the parking lot and said he would see me next Tuesday. He was there the following Tuesday. He has been there every Tuesday since. My mother was slower. She was still in therapy and doing the actual work rather than performing it, which I knew because she had written me a letter, 3 pages in her looping handwriting, the kind that could only have come from someone who had spent real time sitting with the ugliest parts of themselves. It was not a perfect letter. It did not make 24 years of distance disappear. But it was honest in a way she had never been with me before, and honesty was the only currency I was accepting going forward. I wrote back, briefly, carefully, with the precision of someone who has learned the difference between opening a door and dismantling a wall. We were not close yet, but we were in correspondence, which was more than we had been 6 months ago, and I had learned to value increments. Sabrina was the surprise. She had gotten a real job in the marketing department of a Louisville company and had started paying down her own debt without asking anyone for help, which sounds like the minimum requirement for a 30-year-old adult, and would be, except that for Sabrina it represented a genuine departure from every pattern she had ever established. She texted me in March to say she had made her first full payment. She didn't ask for praise. She just said, "Thought you should know." I wrote back, "That's good, Sabrina. Seriously." She sent a single thumbs up. It was the most functional exchange we had ever had, and I held on to it the way you hold on to things that are small but pointed in the right direction. The gathering happened on a Saturday in April, 6 months and 11 days after the ceremony. Grandma Loretta had invited a small group to her house in Shively for what she called a spring dinner, which in practice meant she had been cooking for 2 days and the table was set for 12 and there were people there I had not seen in years. Old neighbors, Aunt Patricia, a woman named Dolores who had been Grandma Loretta's closest friend since 1987 and who greeted me at the door by taking my face in both hands and saying, "I have heard so much about you, baby, you have no idea." I had not known how many people in Grandma Loretta's world knew my name. I had not known how many of them had been quietly rooting for me from a distance for years, through her telling of it, through her consistent and unperformed pride in who I was. Midway through dinner, Dolores tapped her glass and stood up and said she wanted to say something. The table went quiet. She said she had watched Loretta love this family for 40 years, had watched her hold things together and hold her tongue and hold on through things that would have broken other people. She said she had watched Loretta worry about her granddaughter Avery for years. Not the anxious kind of worry, but the certain kind, the kind that comes from knowing someone has more inside them than the room they have been given to put it in. She raised her glass toward me and said, "Here's to the room getting bigger." Grandma Loretta, beside me, reached over and covered my hand with hers without looking at me, the way she did when she wanted to say something without making it a moment I would feel the need to manage. I looked at her anyway. She was already looking at me, and in her expression was everything. The particular piece of a woman who had waited a long time for something she believed in to finally get what it deserved, and was now watching it happen in real time. I did not cry at the table. I waited until I was in her kitchen helping clear the dishes. Just the two of us, the sounds of the dinner party continuing warmly behind the closed door. The kitchen smelled like the sofrito she had been simmering since morning, and something underneath all of it I can only describe as her. Then I put down the plate I was holding and I hugged her, properly the way you hug someone when words are completely insufficient. She hugged me back with the strength that always surprised me in a woman her size. She said into my shoulder, "You're going to be all right, Avery." I said, "I know." And for the first time in my life I meant it without any qualification attached. Without the silent addendum of "I hope" or "I think" or "if I work hard enough" or "if I keep being useful enough for people to keep me around." Just "I know." Clean and entire and entirely mine. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confira Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.